Have you ever wondered what lurks behind the closed doors of a hospital at midnight? Unexplainable events, eerie sounds from empty hallways. Today we're diving into 7 spine-chilling real hospital stories shared by doctors, nurses, and patients on Reddit. A warning: after hearing these, you might never look at a hospital the same way again. A doctor working late at St. Joseph's Hospital in Chicago shared a strange occurrence during a late-night surgery. As he was preparing for an emergency procedure, he heard a faint knock at the door to the operating room. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just an empty chair. But the unsettling part was that the chair hadn't been there earlier. A week later, during another surgery in the same room, the doctor realized that one of his patients who had passed away the week before had been sitting in that chair while waiting for surgery. It seemed as though the patient's spirit hadn't left the hospital, choosing to return in the dead of night. The knock made me turn to check, but I still can't explain why that chair was there. It wasn't supposed to be, the doctor shared in his post. In a hospital in New Orleans, a nurse shared an unsettling story from her time working in the ICU. One night, as she was making her rounds, she noticed something strange. A shadow moving at the end of the hallway. It wasn't the typical shadow cast by a lamp or the reflection of someone walking, but something that seemed to move independently, almost like a person walking but with no clear form. She thought it was just her imagination playing tricks, but then something even more disturbing happened. A few days later, a patient who had been in a coma for weeks suddenly woke up terrified. The patient claimed to have seen a dark figure standing at the foot of their bed, watching them during the night. The nurse realized that the shadow she had seen earlier might not have been her imagination at all. It was almost as if the spirit of someone who passed in the ICU was still lingering, watching over the patients. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us from the end of the hall. That shadow. It felt so real, the nurse wrote, still disturbed by the memory. A Reddit user who worked as a night shift nurse in a hospital in Boston shared a terrifying story about a strange encounter with a patient who had been on life support for several days. The nurse had always felt a strong connection with this patient, who was a retired war veteran, and despite his critical condition, he seemed to hold on to life with surprising strength. One night, as the nurse was walking down the dimly lit hallway to check on the veteran, she heard a soft whisper coming from his room. Thinking it was just a trick of the wind or the hum of the hospital machinery, she dismissed it and entered his room. However, as soon as she stepped inside, she froze in fear. The veteran, who had been completely unresponsive for days, was staring at her with wide eyes, his lips moving as though trying to speak. "What do you want?" she asked softly, her heart racing. The old man slowly whispered, "She's here." The nurse. "She's here." Confused and terrified, the nurse stepped back, unsure of what the man was referring to. As she glanced around the room, she suddenly felt a cold chill run down her spine. The temperature had dropped significantly, and for the briefest moment she could have sworn she saw a faint figure of a woman in the corner of the room. The veteran passed away later that night, but the nurse never forgot the strange, eerie feeling that lingered in that room, as if the spirit of a long-departed nurse had been watching over him. I've worked night shifts for years, but that night there was something different. It wasn't just the patient. It was the feeling that someone else was in the room with us, she recounted. A nurse from a well-known hospital in San Francisco shared an eerie encounter she had while working in the maternity ward. One late shift, she was making her rounds to check on the new mothers and their newborns when she noticed something strange. A door to one of the rooms was slightly ajar, and inside she could see a shadow standing near the bassinet of a newborn. Thinking it was just another nurse or perhaps a family member, she walked in, but the room was completely empty. There was no one in sight, and the baby, who had been asleep moments before, was now wide awake, staring at the corner of the room with an intense, almost fearful expression. As she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The floor was covered in faint, wet footprints leading out of the room and down the hallway, despite there being no sign of any wet surface in the area. The nurse followed the footprints, which eventually disappeared at the end of the hallway where an old, unused storage room sat. When she spoke to her co-workers later, one of them mentioned a chilling piece of hospital history. Years ago, a nurse had tragically passed away in that same maternity ward after an accident, and she had been seen many times by staff members, always around newborns. I don't know what I saw that night, but the baby knew something was there. It was as if that shadow had been watching over them, the nurse shared, still disturbed by the strange, ghostly figure. A former hospital security guard shared an unsettling experience from his time working the graveyard shift at a hospital in Philadelphia. One night he was asked to check on a room that was out of place on the hospital's floor plan. It was a room that had never been officially recorded, and staff didn't know much about it, but strange sounds had been coming from it. Whispers, footsteps, and the occasional loud bang. When the security guard arrived, he found that the room door was locked, and oddly, there were no windows. With a sense of foreboding, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was completely dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency exit signs. The room appeared to be an old storage area with dusty medical equipment, some broken and others seemingly out of place. What unnerved him the most was the feeling of being watched. He felt eyes on him, but when he turned around, no one was there. As he began to leave, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Panicking, he fumbled for his keys to reopen the door, but when he turned back, the room was gone. There was no longer a door to the room, only a blank wall-like space where it once stood. The next morning, when he reported the incident, the hospital staff had no record of any room fitting that description. There was no room on the floor plans, no equipment in storage, and no explanation for what he had seen. I don't know if it was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else. But that room shouldn't have existed, he recalled, shaken by the bizarre experience. In a small hospital in rural Maine, a night shift nurse shared a bone-chilling story that she couldn't explain. It all began with a patient who was recovering from surgery in the ICU. The man had been through a long and complicated procedure, but after a few days he seemed to be improving. However, on the fourth night after his surgery, things took an eerie turn. The nurse was making her usual rounds when she noticed the man was awake, sitting up in his bed, staring at the door. His eyes were wide with terror and his breathing was shallow. "What's wrong?" she asked gently, walking toward him. The man's voice trembled as he responded. "She's here. The nurse. She's been standing at the end of my bed watching me for hours. I tried to call for help, but no one is around." Confused, the nurse looked around the room, but there was no one there. The room was empty except for the man who appeared more frightened by the second. The nurse reassured him that there was no one else in the room and that he was safe, but the patient kept insisting that the mysterious nurse was still there watching from the doorway. The nurse left a call for assistance. But when she returned just a few minutes later, the patient was gone. He had passed away quietly in his sleep. The nurse later discovered that another nurse who had worked at the hospital many years before had died in the same ICU. She had been known for working late shifts and was even reported to have been seen standing at the foot of patients' beds, keeping watch over them until they were ready to pass. I can't explain what happened that night, but when I learned about the other nurse, it made my skin crawl. It was like she had come back to help him. Or maybe to take him, the nurse recalled, still haunted by the memory. One Reddit user, a paramedic working the night shift at a busy hospital in Los Angeles, shared a terrifying experience that occurred while he was responding to a particularly traumatic case. It was late at night, and the emergency room was relatively quiet with only a few patients waiting to be seen. As he was preparing to leave for another call, he noticed something unusual at the far end of the ER. A dark figure, tall and imposing, was standing in the corner. The figure seemed to be watching the staff and patients, its presence unsettling. At first, the paramedic thought it was a trick of the lights or his tired eyes playing tricks on him. But as he took a step closer, the figure remained perfectly still. His heart began to race as he realized this wasn't just a shadow. He walked past the figure, his nerves tingling with anxiety. When he glanced back over his shoulder, the shadow seemed to be following him, always just out of reach, always just a few steps behind. The air in the room had grown colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled him. Just as he was about to approach the nurse's station, he heard a low, guttural whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible. "Leave, now." The paramedic rushed out of the ER to gather his thoughts and regain his composure. When he returned to the ER later that evening, he asked one of the nurses about the strange figure he had seen. To his shock, the nurse mentioned that several other staff members had seen a similar figure over the years, always in the same spot, always near the entrance. No one could explain it, but they all knew one thing: the shadow seemed to appear when the hospital was dealing with a particularly grim or fatal emergency. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was waiting for someone, the paramedic said, visibly shaken by the memory of that night. As we wrap up these spine-chilling stories, it's important to remember that these aren't just stories pulled from fiction or urban legends. They're real experiences shared by people who have lived through them. Whether it's the ghostly whispers in the halls, the mysterious figures lurking at the end of dark corridors, or the chilling presence of the unknown hospitals with all their life and death occurrences, seem to be places where the lines between the living and the dead often blur. Next time you find yourself in a hospital, whether as a patient visitor or healthcare worker, remember you're not the only one in the room. The spirits of those who have passed, the memories of those who remain, might just be watching, waiting in the shadows.